Our next speaker is Hamish. He's the Director of MCM Strategic Communications. Hamish has more than 20 years of experience in a number of senior communication roles where he has advised some of the world's largest and best-known companies, high-profile industry associations and government departments and agencies. And as a result, he's had has a broad network of contacts among Australia's federal ministers, shadow ministers, ministerial advisors, shadow ministerial advisors, backbenchers, senators, including the balance of power. And we're delighted to have Hamish with us this afternoon on his presentation about the federal election overview, which will be interesting indeed. Please welcome Hamish Arthur. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me along. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And what was not mentioned earlier is, for those who aren't aware, one of our clients is the AACB. So, and we're also, our company's just about to do a bit of work with the Adelaide Convention Bureau as well, which we're really looking forward to, with the state election looming over there as well. But we're here today to talk about federal politics, the big labyrinth that's Canberra, my hometown where I live, and what's been going on there. Well, it's interesting to say the least, and what I'd like to do over the next few minutes or so is give you a bit of an insight into what's happened both during the election campaign, election day itself, and the period since. And if last week's any indication, we're certainly in for a bumpy ride over the next period, whatever period that may be in terms of the 45th Parliament. So to the election itself. Of course, it was as called by Malcolm Turnbull some 2 months before July, for Saturday, July the 2nd, and we had one of the world's longest ever election campaigns. Everyone was so excited about it, weren't they? Yeah? And if I could just talk through from my perspective and the various different industry bodies or big corporates or even government agencies that we do work for, my perspectives on the election were that the first 3 or 4 weeks was just almost business as usual. It was things were happening. You could go and meet with ministerial advisors. You'd bump into people. People weren't that busy and so forth. One ministerial advisor I spoke to, he said, "Mate, I am so bored. Bring those defence guys in here. Let's come and have a chat." Things like that just wouldn't normally happen in elections because people are just so busy. But of course, it did get serious in the last perhaps the last 3 weeks were when things did get serious. But of course, all the way through, and I've used a bit of a horse racing analogy. You can see here because football season's nearly finished. We're about to head into spring racing season, but everyone was expecting Malcolm Turnbull to win like that. He was going to win. He was popular. The bookmakers' odds were, I think, Labor was at about $7, Turnbull was at about $1.10. It was all going to be smooth sailing. What we actually ended up with was this. And we didn't end up with a hung parliament. We'll look at the mechanics in a second, but we did end up with something that was really, really close. And you recall the previous hung parliament in 2010 between Julia Gillard, when the election was fought between Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott. Famously, there was 17 days that it took to work out who was in government. Well, this one took 8 days. It wasn't until the Sunday, not Sunday, July the 3rd, but Sunday, July the 10th, when Bill Shorten actually stood up and said, "I don't think we're going to be able to form, Labor's not going to be able to form a government, so I'm conceding defeat to Malcolm Turnbull." So it took a long time and a lot of counting, and there were some really close seats, including the seat of Herbert up around Townsville, which I think was decided on a recount by about 36 votes. And it was an incredibly close election. And the close election is going to shape everything that we see over this next term of Parliament. Now, ordinarily I'd say 3 years, but I'm not going to say 3 years. I'll explain a bit about that as we go through the presentation. But that is everything that goes on in Canberra in terms of engaging with government is going to be shaped by the election outcome. So what we were left with in the House of Representatives of this, so 150 seats for those of you who aren't familiar. So the magical number is 76, and that's what the coalition got, just. They just got there. And I think the key seat for mine was one of the ones here in Queensland, which was the seat, I think it's up around Rockhampton, which Michelle Landry won for the Nationals, Capricornia. That was probably the key seat. That was only won by a handful of votes as well. And really, that was what got the coalition back into government. The National Party did really well. The Liberal Party did really poorly. They lost lots of seats. Labor picked up plenty of seats. And we were left with 5 on the crossbench, okay? Let me talk you through those quickly. So obviously the one Green is Adam Band, who's the member for Melbourne. Greens have now held that seat seat for a couple of elections, and will probably hold it unless Labor can do something to haul them back there. Okay, so they've still got that presence in the lower house. We've got a Nick Xenophon team candidate who got up in the Adelaide Hills seat of Mayo, Rebecca Sharkey, which was previously a safe Liberal seat. It was previously held by Alexander Downer when he was the Minister for Foreign Affairs, so a blue ribbon Liberal seat. Cathy McGowan, who's the member for Indi, which is northeastern Victoria around Albury-Wodonga. Again, another former blue ribbon Liberal seat, which is now held by an independent. And the other two, Andrew Wilkie, who's the member for the Tasmanian seat of Denison, which is around Hobart, and Bob Catter, who's the long-time member for Kennedy, sort of up in regional Queensland, as Queenslanders in the room will know. So that's who the crossbench are. Now, one of the first things that Malcolm Turnbull did after the election was to go and talk to the crossbench, even before he spoke to some in his own party. Okay, so he recognised really quickly that, hey, this is going to be close. And I don't need these guys to govern at the moment, but I may well need them in the makeup of the parliament as legislation goes through, or I may well need them to maintain government even. We'll talk about that in a second as well. And what he ended up with was not written agreements as Julia Gillard had with the independents in 2010, but he had, if you like, handshake agreements with Cathy McGowan, who's the, as I said, one of the independent members for Indi in regional Victoria, and Bob Catter. Okay, and what they said was, look, we're not going to play silly buggers. You can remember that term if you like. We want this government to stay in power unless something unforeseen happens, okay? And then Andrew Wilkie was an interesting one as well, because he essentially represents what was an old Labor seat of Denison in Hobart, and he's probably, well, certainly his constituency is more aligned to the Labor side of politics. He didn't do a deal with Turnbull, but he was at pains to point out that he didn't do it, but he did make a public statement that said, look, I'm not going to do something silly either unless the government, descends into chaos or whatever the case is. So, as I said, one of the first things that returned Prime Minister Turnbull did after the election was to go and talk to that crossbench. And as I said earlier, everything in this 45th Parliament is going to be shaped by that. So, in terms of the consequences, there are plenty of them. One of the criticisms that John Howard, I think, rightly made of Julia Gillard when she was the Prime Minister was that she lacked authority over her 3-year term. She'd never had that prime ministerial presence, if you like, and even though she was putting plenty of legislation through the Parliament, and Labor, when they were in government, made a big point of that, there was always that feeling that she lacked authority. I mean, she overthrew Kevin Rudd. She had to form a minority government after the 2010 election, and it was a fair criticism. So the boot's now on the other foot, isn't it, John Howard? And Malcolm Turnbull is lacking authority. Well, look, that's the reality of it. I mean, he made those comments and he should stand by them. He hasn't said them publicly recently, though, I might add. But the reality of it is that is a big factor. And the other part of that, which I haven't put on the screen as well, is the challenges within Malcolm Turnbull's own party. I mean, it's well documented. There's the Conservative wing and there's the moderate wing. And certainly the leadership change in September last year with Tony Abbott as the flag waver for the Conservative wing, Malcolm Turnbull the flag waver for the moderate wing of the party. It's an incredibly tense environment, okay? And that is already shaping many of the policy decisions that are being made and the decisions and announcements that are being made. I think one stark example, if you like, was the decision not to back Kevin Rudd for the position at the United Nations. Certainly there were plenty in the Conservative side of the Liberals that were just not going to have that. And while there were plenty of moderates, Julie Bishop being among them, saying that Australia should endorse Kevin Rudd, he's an Australian, he's a former Prime Minister, it didn't happen, largely because of the pressure from the Conservative wing. And I think that was a really good example of one of the challenges that PM Turnbull faces. The opposition are emboldened. They are. Scott Morrison stood up in the Parliament the first week back last week and had to remind them that you didn't win the election, you ran second. But they, Bill Shorten, he went from being very unpopular at the end of last year to being viewed by a decent amount of Australians as being an alternative Prime Minister. And there's still plenty of people who think that Bill won't be Prime Minister, but the reality of it is a lot of people voted for him, they won a lot of seats and they came incredibly close. And he, as the opposition leader who stayed on, which is, again, unusual in Australian politics. Normally when an opposition leader loses an election, well, that's been the tradition, they don't continue on, but he has continued on. And he's certainly looking confident and even more like leadership material than ever before, okay? And I've been to a couple of functions with him since the election. He's made a real point of saying, look, my party is not divided, they're all behind me. So he's really trying to sort of draw those lines and draw those distinctions between him and the government on that. It's just in terms of policy directions, I mean, this is a low political risk environment, and that means challenges around reform. Do we need some of the reform that Australia needs to really get the economy moving? That's likely to take a back seat simply because the government doesn't have the political capital to push through those sort of reforms, okay? And if I can give you a real-life comparison, you saw in New South Wales when Mike Baird took the power asset sales to the last state election there, he said, this is one of my key issues. We need to do this because we need the money to build infrastructure in Sydney because our population is really expanding. He took that to the election, he was endorsed, and of course he's implementing it in government. And there's the comparison with, a thumping win for Mike Baird. Malcolm Turnbull only just returned, and that's the challenge with political capital. So what can we expect? Well, the short answer is that we can expect plenty. And don't hold me to any of these, but we can have a look in 2 years' time if you like, and look back at this slide and it'll either be a goose or a genius or somewhere in between. I think the government will lose its majority, okay? History would show that over the course of Commonwealth parliaments, it's very unusual for there not to be changes in the pie chart that we saw on the screen earlier. And what I mean by that is we'll see a member unfortunately die, but more likely is that one of the coalition MPs or even more will say, look, I cannot go with my party on this issue and I'm going to defect. And I'm going to go onto the crossbench and I want to make a real big deal of this. I want to be really important. I want the government coming to me and hearing my position. And they won't be frightened to come out and make that call. And we've already seen a sort of bits and pieces of that already around some of the policy issues like superannuation and so forth. But I think there's a real risk the government could lose its majority. And of course, the real consequence of that goes back to the other slide where Malcolm Turnbull's authority gets eaten away and again, okay? And that's why he needs the two independents that he's got the agreements with as well. Because if we go back to 75, which isn't a majority in the House of Representatives, he's going to need them if he's going to win votes on the floor, which didn't happen last week. And again, that was another attack on his authority. And for those who didn't know what happened last Thursday, some of his members left the parliament early on Thursday before it rose, and Labor called on a series of votes. And the coalition lost 2 or 3 of them. Now, they're on procedural motions, they weren't on policy issues, but again, it was another kick in the backside for a government which is really on its knees. And thinking about this, we're only, weeks into the new electoral cycle. Normally a return government will get a bounce in the polls, but the reality of it is they're not and they're struggling. So if the government does lose its majority, what does that mean for the crossbench? Well, it means they become more powerful. So all of a sudden, if Turnbull loses 1 or 2 of his members, he's down to 74 and he needs those extra couple of votes. What does that mean? That means that the likes of Andrew Wilkie, Cathy McGowan, Bob Katter, or even the ones who aren't aligned to the government, they can go to the government and say, look, we have a particular issue. This is a real pet issue of mine. I want it pursued. Otherwise, I'm not going to be supporting you on the floor of the House. And the government has to listen to that and they have to try to deal with it. Okay, so really important. The opposition, and it was interesting to hear Bill Shorten talk a couple of days ago about this. He used the 2 words, the current opposition as an alternative government is here to be adversarial as opposed to confrontational. So what he's trying to do is, to give you some insights there, is he is trying to hold the government to account, but he's by using those particular, those phrases or words, he's really saying, look, I'm not going to be like Tony Abbott. I'm not going to be here and sort of tear down the government and be really negative, but we are going to hold them to account, and particularly on the measures that are very much core to us. So I think he's got a subtle distinction. Of course, time will tell how that plays out in the new parliament. And of course, there's always the threat of an early election. And particularly someone who's been particularly vocal about this, and certainly there's a vested interest there for the opposition to communicate messages publicly along those lines, is Anthony Albanese. And he has predicted on more than one occasion that he thinks the government will last about a year. Now, if you're asking me what the mechanism is for an early election, I'm not going to predict that at all. Okay? But what we have seen in Australian politics, particularly since the night that Kevin Rudd's downfall in 2010, is we've seen things happen that haven't happened for many years or are very rare in politics, and it's a very volatile environment. And we don't know what's going to play out given all those challenges the government faces. Could there be leadership ructions again? Could it be a policy issue? I mean, Malcolm Turnbull lost the leadership of the Liberal Party, as you might recall, in 2009 over climate change. He said, look, we're pushing through this policy, and basically the Conservative wing of the Liberal Party said, no, we're not. and they stood firm until he was forced out of the leadership. So who knows what could happen. And as I said, there's certainly a risk of an early election. And the other thing to keep in mind with the election timing is the next election would ordinarily be in 3 years' time, federal election, but there are some machinations around state elections at that time which make that timing a bit difficult. I think there's a New South Wales state election due in early 2019 and a Victorian state election due in late 2018. So there's some challenges there around crossover, which could come into play. That's if the government today in Canberra lasts that long. In terms of the policy battlegrounds, they're pretty self-explanatory on the screen. They're the ones that the Canberra Press Gallery tries to talk about a lot, or does talk about a lot, I should say, particularly superannuation. It was such a contentious point through the campaign. And again, it was another one that caused real friction and still continues to cause friction within the Liberal Party. Okay. The opposition is unrelenting in its push for a Royal Commission into the banks and the financial services system. And the other issue which came up during the election campaign was some of the union involvement in the CFA in Victoria, and of course that's linked to the Australian Building and Construction Bill, which of course was the reason why we had a double dissolution election, and the entire Senate has been made over. And it would be remiss of me, when I'm not talking about the election, to talk about the Mediscare campaign, which was very successful by Labor and certainly was one of the key reasons why it came so close to winning the election without quite getting there. Now up to the Senate. So this is a different story for the 76 seats there. So we've got no party has got a majority of the Senate. In fact, to put this in perspective, it is rare for parties to have a majority in the Senate. Okay, we've only seen it, I think, from 2005 to 2008 was about once in 30 years, and that was the last term of John Howard's government. And the coalition got that absolute majority in the Senate, which created a bit of a different dynamic. The absolute majority means that they can just, obviously they've got a majority in the lower house, so when they put through legislation, it goes through there. When it goes through the upper house, again, as long as there's not too much interference, that means the legislation can go through as well. And that's the key point about the new Senate, the interference, if you like. Because to pass legislation in that new Senate, you're going to need 39 votes. So the reality of it is, if the two major parties are disagreeing, the Coalition and the Labor Party, you can see the two different figures there. The 30 in the Coalition, that's providing they're all there and they haven't gone home early, they're going to need 9 of the other 11 crossbench votes. That's working on the basis that Labor and the Greens aren't supporting them, okay? Now that's a lot, all right? And that crossbench, we'll come to them in a second, they're many and varied and they come from different ends of the political spectrum, some in the centre, some on the right, some on the left and so forth. That's one of the key challenges. In fact, some have likened the crossbench to this. And on the crossbench, you've got a couple of real key power brokers. So on the left, Pauline Hanson did amazingly well at the election. She, and for those who are really close to it, and particularly one of the coalition ministers said to me, she's definitely coming back, and that was 2 weeks before the election. She didn't just come back, she's got 4 spots. Okay, she's got 2 here in Queensland, she's got 1 in New South Wales. At the moment, she's got 1 in Western Australia as well, but I think that guy's facing some charges or something coming up soon. So that's, yeah, he's got some early challenges on his plate. But the reality of it is 500,000 people voted for her, okay? And there's lots of people who don't agree with their political views, but there's lots who do as well. And she is going to be a key player, there's no doubt about it. And Nick Xenophon, who's in what he likes to call the sensible centre. But the reality of it is he is a protectionist, he's a populist, and all of his policy positions are framed around those 2 mantras, if you like. He's got 1 in the lower house, as I mentioned earlier. He's got 2 alongside of him in the upper house. If anyone can name his other 2 senators, yeah, I didn't think so. So Sterling Griff and Skye Kokoschki-Moore. There you go. That'd be a good one for a trivia night. So, but seriously, he has got a strong presence. They're all from South Australia's home state. He didn't win any seats outside of South Australia, but he is a real wheeler and dealer. And I think the early indications of the power that he's wielding was there's been a lot of debate in Canberra on the same-sex marriage plebiscite, whether it should go ahead or whether there should be a vote in the Parliament on same-sex marriage. Nick Xenophon came out last week and said his 3 senators, which is in brackets him, are not going to support a plebiscite, and therefore it looks like the government might not have the numbers to put through the legislation for a plebiscite to happen. So that little microcosm, if you like, shows the power that someone like Nick Xenophon is already wielding. And To wrap up the presentation before we take some questions, I'm sure you've got a few, is just the key players. And of course, we saw Minister Pitt here yesterday, but and you all, Mr. Chobo is really well known to you guys, and he's a fabulous advocate for your sector, no doubt, in business events. He understands the industry. He comes from a seat like the Gold Coast, which has got a great both leisure tourism footprint and business tourism footprint, and he's a great advocate for your industry. And in case you weren't aware, he was in London. He's been in London this week, and held a meeting specifically to promote business events in Australia, which is just an indication of how passionate he is about the industry. In fact, I was at a conference about a month ago with one of my other clients down on the Gold Coast with nothing to do with your space. But he got up at the start of the conference when he was opening and said, it's great to have a business event on the Gold Coast, and he really made a point of saying that. So he's a terrific ambassador for your industry, which is excellent. So Keith Pitt, who spoke yesterday, is new to the role. Regional Queensland MP, has been really passionate about things like looking after the interests of regional people, and particularly things like media reforms. I know Mitch Fifield's office said to me, that Keith Pitt guy, he's always ringing up trying to say we've got to have enough local news in our in the electorates. So he's a really passionate guy, and I think he'll be a great addition to the the trade, tourism, and investment portfolio. And underneath there, another face that's probably familiar to plenty of you, Trent Zimmerman. So if you're not aware, of course, the former Deputy CEO of TTF, and he went into the Parliament via a by-election for the seat of North Sydney, which was vacated by Joe Hockey. He is now the convener of the government's Friends of Tourism, which is a fantastic outcome. He'll be a terrific member of Parliament. He'll be there for a long time in a seat like North Sydney, and a really good advocate for the industry as well. So that's fantastic news. And on the Labor side, obviously Anthony Albanese's retained the tourism and infrastructure portfolios, which is terrific. No doubt there's a bit of education there to be done with him around the importance of business events, because the policy that Albo and Labor released was sadly silent on that on that side of things. So there's a bit of work there to be done. And the other one who's really important, I think she does understand your sector, I caught up with her this week, is Terry Butler. And she's the bottom right of the screen. Of course, her electorate of Griffith is just here in Brisbane, just across the other side of the river. It's Kevin Rudd's old seat. She's really passionate about tourism as well. She is going to retain the Opposition Friends of Tourism title, which is fantastic as well. So I think that's really good. And can I just say, given the machinations of the new Parliament, my view is, and certainly this is a view that I've shared with all of my clients, is that engaging with the opposition is more important than ever before. And the reason being that because of the fragile nature of the Parliament, if there is an early election or if there is major change, having those relationships with the opposition is really important. So it's not quite like they're in government, but it's just important to keep those relationships across the political divide. So to wrap it up, and the challenges that are facing your sector in Canberra. So tourism more broadly, no doubt the fragmentation of the industry representation remains an issue. There are a lot of industry bodies. There are a lot of people coming to Canberra. I've worked, in tourism industry bodies. I've worked for them in a consulting role and so forth. Sometimes I struggle to actually work out what each of the individuals does. And that's, if I'm struggling to do that, if you're a politician who doesn't know much about tourism policy in the tourism industry, that's a real challenge. And you compare that alongside the mining industry or the pharmaceutical, the pharmacy industry, although the pharmaceuticals are pretty good as well. They are big, strong, powerful lobbies, like the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, those sort of players, and the AMA, the Medical Association. Everyone knows what they do. They've got a powerful voice. Tourism is fragmented, and that's the challenge. Similar in the business events sector, but there's steps being changed to change that, which is really important. Having the AACB in Canberra, do not underestimate the importance of that. It's really important from a convenience point of view in terms of meetings and so forth. But just having a Canberra address, we're based in Canberra, our business is in Canberra. That's where the centre of government is, and I think that is a real advantage that the AACB is already leveraging through Andrew and the team as well. And part of that, and part of the work that we're doing, is really creating a high level of awareness among Canberra public servants about tourism. And Andrew and myself, he's probably communicated to some of you, we've had meetings with Treasury and Department of Finance. And Department of Finance, they are the toughest nuts in the game. As they said in the meeting, Andrew, our job is to say no, okay? And if Tourism Australia want $50 million more money, we'll ask them where they're going to get it from, because we're certainly not going to give it to them. And that's the type of things that they say. And that's being able to pitch the messages that you've got there and understand how they think, but getting them to understand the benefits of tourism and understand the benefits of business events in your case, that's the key challenge as well. And that is an ongoing challenge. And I think everyone in tourism and business events has to take responsibility for that. Of course, the tight fiscal environment, that's what finance were referring to when they made those comments. And of course, we've also talked about the volatile political environment as well. So there are a number of challenges, but certainly if you do the work and put the effort in and engage with the right stakeholders, the rewards will certainly be there. I think that was as he was about to lose the vote last week. So was there any questions about any of that?
We've got Kylie with the microphone, so certainly just put your hand up. Yes, just one down the front, and then just behind you, Kylie.
Thanks. It's the lack of awareness of the value of business events and tourism among politicians. That's been going on for years. We've also acknowledged that, it's the permanent public servants, senior public servants sector in there that also, they need to be engaged. How permanent and how stable is that band of senior public servants in finance and those key areas that also need to be influenced? Or is there a lot of turnover in those jobs as well? Just trying to get a sense of, okay, if we're going to go in there and engage that segment within Canberra, how tough is it going to be?
Yeah, sure. It's not tough at all. Our taxes pay their wages for starters. Sometimes I have to remind some of them that as well because they forget that. But look, to be serious, there's probably, from my perspective, and every department is slightly different, but there's probably 3 levels broadly in each department in terms of senior officials. You've got your top levels, the secretaries, and I've certainly engaged with plenty of people at that level, and there's some really fine operators. I was in with Mike Murdoch a couple of weeks ago, who's the Secretary of the Department of Infrastructure and Transport, I think it is these days. He's a first-class public servant who's bipartisan. He's got great credit for both sides of government that he's worked with as well. So, he's a really top operator and been there for a fair few years now as well, coming across from Prime Minister and Cabinet. There's the next level, which is where Mike used to be, your first assistant secretary level, and they're pretty stable as well. And they're probably the ones that, when there is change at the top of each department, they're the ones, the really good ones will move into those top positions. So it's a little bit like politics in a way. If you can form some relationships with that next level down, that's really important too. And then you've sort of got what I call your nuts and bolts senior officials, if you like, your group managers and your assistant secretaries. They're still important players and they're working their way up. And certainly there's some smart people in that group as well, and particularly in some of the really good departments in Canberra. But they do shuffle around departments. They are career public servants, but there's no reason why you can't get and influence all 3 of those levels. I think if you're playing below that, you're struggling a bit because some of them are probably just coming in and ticking the box and going home at 5 o'clock each night in those lower levels, and that's to be truthful. But as I said, in those top levels, there's some really smart people. They will listen. You need to go in with the right messages and preparation, though, and know what to expect. And I think having a broad understanding of the policy principles, we talked about things like, the example from finance the other day was saying, okay, if we're going to take some money from here, what are we going to do to be able to balance the books, so to speak? That's a prime example of that as well. So, yeah, I think there is movement, but it's not every 6 months or so. It's probably every couple of years. And I think if you do the work, you can engage.
Hello. I wondered if you could elaborate on the practical benefits of the AACB being located in Canberra. Is it just merely the Canberra address, as you said, and the proximity to the Parliament making AACB more available for meetings with the broad range of Parliament members, or is it broader than that? It's
all of the above, yep, and probably even a bit more. So what it is from a logistical point of view, so when myself, Andrew, any other person in the government relations game who's based in Canberra, someone rings up from the minister's office and said, oh, look, do you want to go and catch up for a coffee? When can we do it? You don't have to book a flight. You don't have to book a hotel. You can just shuffle around things, hopefully, whatever you're doing work-wise or personal-wise, and you can go and do it. You can go and do several of those as well. And you can, might be having dinner with a key advisor or someone within a government department and so forth. That's the practicalities of it. The other side of it is, the people you engage with outside of work. And I look at some of our kids' footy teams that I know, one of my youngest son's teams, and the other side that played, I think Treasury's head of revenue, he had a son that was in that team, and actually one of the guys that I think he's the second most senior public servant in the Australian Australian ACMA, the media regulator. Fantastic guy. He and I share the goal umpiring duties. Things like that. I hardly ever talk to him about ACMA stuff. I mean, I don't really have any clients in that space either. But you're mixing with these sort of people, and there's some seriously good public servants in that lot as well. So there's that side of things. There's people you see down at the supermarket or the shop as well. Canberra, like it or not, the biggest industry in Canberra is government. So all those sorts of things. And I think perception, you're serious. I mean, the reality of it is the top 4 or 5 lobby groups in Canberra, I mentioned some of them earlier, in my view, are people like the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Pharmacy Guild. The Pharmacy Guild are number 1. Okay, for people who don't know, they are the number 1 lobby group, federal lobby group in Canberra. And they represent the pharmacies, and they've got a big building on Brisbane Avenue, and they've got a big lobbying presence. They don't have a big media presence. That's why they're so effective. But I was having a chat to Ian McFarlane about this at the end of last year before he left Parliament. And I said, who's number 1? He goes, oh, mate, it's the Pharmacy Guild. And I said, why? And he said, oh, they're ruthless, they're smart, they get and do it. He was emphatic. He was absolutely emphatic. And again, they're in Canberra. The AMA are in Canberra as well. So the ones who are in Canberra and the ones who've got a really big presence, that's for all of those sorts of reasons. So probably all of that and even a bit more.
Just down here. Yeah, thank you.
Hamish, you weren't here yesterday, but we had a panel of 3 young men that have the solution to the problem in Canberra, and that's that they should all go to a bar and get drunk.
The Star Wars bar?
Any bar. I think they just need to talk it out. And that leads me to the reputation of Australia. I think we've got some real challenges moving forward. I mean, if a Royal Commission gets up into banking, what is that saying to the world about inward investment and capital throughput? And when we're trying to attract big financial services and professional services events, it does have an impact. Our human rights reputation is not good. And then you have a government, and if you look back for Labor, Gillard-Rudd, I know you're not a brand expert, but it's something for us to think about in terms of Australia's reputation and how we're perceived internationally with what's going on.
Yeah, I think brand is a really good word to use, I reckon. That's a really good point. And again, I heard Bill Shorten talk about this the other night. He recognises, and it'd be interesting to see the fact that he recognises and does something about it might be 2 different things. But I think, and we saw this through the results of the election too, I mean, the reality of it is some 3 in 10 people voted for minor parties at the federal election. The drift away from the major parties is real. And I think, and there's probably many in this room who agree, is people's view of politicians is probably at its lowest ebb. Okay? You look at Malcolm Turnbull's popularity is probably, in the opinion polls, is probably symptomatic of that as well. He went from being up here this time last year to almost losing the election within the space of 12 months. And I'm standing up here saying, well, how long has he got to go? I mean, really, you look at the period, leading up to 2007, how many prime ministers do we have since, the 80s? About 4. We've had 4 since then. And we're turning over prime ministers. And this goes to our reputation on the national stage as well. And in the international stage, I think it's really important. I think rebuilding that trust is a challenge, and I think there's a lot of MPs, unfortunately, who are looking at the short-term outcomes and not what's best for the country. And there's a whole range of reasons for that too, but I think it is an issue. The investment side, absolutely agree with that. It would send some difficult messages internationally. I mean, we've got some of the Foreign Investment Review Board decisions which have been made in recent times about Chinese investment and so forth. I mean, again, especially in the tourism industry, it's a huge source of investment from overseas. So I think it is a real issue, and it's something that Australia needs to be awake to, yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions at all? All right. That was a great insight into how things play in the federal arena. And can you please thank Hamish Arthur as well for a great insight. Thank you.